No, I mean, it's been a very, very changing phenomenon. And the changing phenomenon becomes more complicated once you have the Constantinian settlement with the church, and the church becomes an official legalized institution. It had gone through a period before Diocletian's persecution where it was more openly, but still never really fully institutionally accepted. But once it becomes institutionally accepted, you've got this problem that immediately manifests itself, that when the church is an institution that it becomes somewhat profitable to become part of, you start to get people attracted to the clergy who ought not to be attracted to the clergy, and then a need for some way of dealing with this, and also dealing with governmental concerns about an institution which is going to begin to then play a significant role that will have political consequences as well. So you've got that problem that intervenes in the picture. Then, with specifically the papacy, obviously in the western part of the empire, which falls apart in the latter part of the 400s, there's going to be a concern on the part of even the pagan members of the old senatorial aristocracy, who are very, very influential. Both Christian and pagan members of the Senate are very influential still until you get into the 500s. And they're going to want a role in determining who becomes the Pope as well. So the way this thing ends up starting to play out, and there's one intervening period which I have to go into that creates an interruption in what I'm going to be saying here and have to go back to again, is you get developing this system where the clergy of Rome and then the people of Rome are having a role in electing who the Pope is. But just as in our own day, we've got this question about what the people really means. The people of Rome, to a large degree, will mean the Senate, and that means the elite being involved in the election of the Pope. And that's going to have a great significance in the late 400s and then continuing on till the 530s. Now, what happens to intervene for a good long period from the 530s down through until really the 700s, most importantly in the middle of the 600s, but then strictly speaking down to the middle of the 700s as well, is that there is this major effort at reconquering the western part of the Roman Empire that's conducted by the Emperor Justinian from Constantinople. And it involved a brutal war against the barbarians in the 500s that went on for a good number of years, but ends with the Reconquest and ends, therefore, with the emperor in Constantinople demanding, through his representative, who took his seat in the city of Ravenna in northeastern Italy, who demands a role in at least confirming who the Pope is going to be. So if there's the clergy and the people involved, the emperor is going to have a final say for a good long period of time in determining who the Pope is. And who are the people of Rome that have a say? Well, it's going to be really those that are influential with the governor, the man who's called the exarch, who is the agent of the emperor as well. Now that fades away as the empire in the east has problems with the Persians and the Muslims, and is not really able to have an effective hold on the papacy, and that manifests itself very significantly by the 700s. There's then this desire on the popes to find protection politically by the alliance that's made famously with the Franks, who had become Catholics, the earliest among the barbarian tribes in the West, and who, when a deal is made with the Franks, that's given political strength in Italy through the intervention of the Franks to protect the papacy from another German tribe, the Lombards, in the 700s, the Franks are going to want to have a say in determining who is the Pope as well. However, again, with this constant changeover, with ups and downs, with Romans and barbarian tribes and the like, the empire that was momentarily reestablished by Charlemagne fades away when you get into the 800s. And then you've got this situation where it's really local forces that are going to play a role in determining who's the Pope in a very significant fashion. Now, strictly speaking, it's the same kind of argument. It's the clergy of Rome and the people of Rome. But who are the people? Who is the deep state really in this time period? It's going to be these local battling Roman oligarchical families, and also the armed forces that are at their disposal, and they are often battling armed forces as well. The papacy by the 900s and then into the 1000s as well is really at the mercy of what it is that these local nobles, but I mean, they're not in their behavior as noble as we would consider nobles ought to be. They're the ones who call the shots. And this becomes a great, great embarrassment to the huge reform movement that was taking shape in the world outside of Italy, but with also allies inside Italy as well. That's most famously, although it's not really solely connected with the monastic reform that takes place in Burgundy, that's most associated with the monastery of Cluny. So that people often talk about the Clunaic reform, which is an effort to reform the church by trying to make sure that local monasteries and local bishops, and then ultimately the papacy as the most important bishopric in the church, are really under the control of church forces, of clerical forces. But in order to be able to try to free the church from the really motley array of different local, noble, military, new barbaric, you name it, forces that had managed to glom onto and control local dioceses and local monasteries and the lands that are connected with them. What you had to do is you had to find a way to find somebody or some number of people with military strength who were willing to try to work together with you in a way that that tried to do what it is that local reform monastic forces or diocesan forces might want to do. So it always involved some kind of political help in order for you to see if you could really build a spiritual church and not one that was dominated by political forces, even though you needed some political help to do this. I mean, it's inevitable that you need some kind of strength that's going to work, hopefully, primarily for the ultimate spiritual goal. Now, what is important about this that gets us back to the papacy is that these monks of Cluny and then others who were related to them, who were working for an effort to really get the church to be primarily focused on its spiritual activities, they managed to get a number of very important political forces allied with them. And the most important one, by the time you got into the 900s and 1000s, was the political force that came from the newly strengthened kings of Germany. The Charlemagne's empire was an empire that was really centered in areas that form part of present-day France and then the Low Countries and Germany. And when it split up in such a way that it was going to build the future kingdom of France, a mishmash of different forces in the middle, and then a new kingdom of Germany, and really the whole history militarily of Europe for a long period of time down to the 20th century ends up being a battle of the Western French focused forces and the Eastern German focused forces for control over the middle as well. But the Kingdom of Germany became strong again in the 900s. And the new Kingdom of Germany that became strong wanted to solidify the power of the central power of the kings by making sure that they were not dependent upon all sorts of local forces that were family-based forces that through trying to promote the strength of the local family through birth generation after generation would weaken the ability of the central authority to govern. So that it was to the advantage of the kings of Germany to make sure that they had bishops and monks, because these monks with their abbeys were very, very, very strong potentially as forces, not just spiritually but economically as well. They wanted to make sure that they were people who were celibate and didn't have families, and so they worked closely together with them to clean up the bishops that in Germany were also in many respects enslaved to local family forces, and monks who wanted to be free from being enslaved to local family forces. And all of these, as part of their reform movement, were keen to get the papacy out of the hands of local family concerns. So you have these descents of the kings of Germany, first in the 900s and then much more effectively in the 1000s, on Rome to throw out popes who are subject to local family forces, some of whom are pretty miserable and corrupt, to say the least, so that what you can get are popes who are spiritually focused. Now, the problem is that the German kings, they have so many far-flung responsibilities that they couldn't always stay in Italy. So the first efforts to try to do this in the 900s fizzle out. Then what happens in the 1040s is that there's a new effort of the kings of Germany with a newly strengthened assistance of all of these reformed forces coming from outside Italy that descend on Italy and then name a pope. It happened to be a German pope, Pope Leo the Ninth, in the 1040s, who was a solid reforming figure. And then what this pope did was he associated with him in ruling a number of advisors who represented all of these international forces, which become really the nucleus, and then named such very, very quickly afterwards, of what we call the College of Cardinals. There had always been people who were looked upon as, to use the name, the etymology of the name, as hinges, cardex, on which the papacy would try to help to build its rule. But now you get this body of really reform-minded international cardinals who are then going to be looked to very swiftly by the middle of the 1000s to elect the next popes. And what's going to happen is that even though the first generation of these cardinals saw and were grateful to the kings of Germany, who also have, from the time of Otto the Great in the 900s, they also gained the title of Roman Emperor again, what we in English call Holy Roman Emperors. The first generation was very grateful for the help that they got from these forces. But the next generation wanted to make absolutely certain that the election of the Pope would be a totally free election. The first interventions of these German king emperors were interventions where the German king emperors named the Pope. And they were good popes that they named, but they named them, and the next generation didn't want that to continue. And it's that generation that's most famously connected with St. Gregory VII, the great reforming pope, so that people also refer to the Cluniac reform as it develops as the Gregorian reform. The Gregorian reform. And Pope Gregory, in a famous set of statements in the 1070s, announced that there would be no further involvement of outside political forces in the naming of the Pope, which would be in the hands of the College of Cardinals, and that what he wanted was a church throughout Christendom in which political forces would not be involved in naming the bishops or anybody else of significance. And this was a tough kind of project given hundreds of years where nothing of this had ever existed to come about. Ironically, Gregory, who makes this statement, is irregularly elected because what happened is that rather than the cardinals electing him, he was immediately acclaimed by everybody in Rome as the Pope. And so this could be used as an argument against him. But in any case, we then have all of these battles that go on in the 1000s and in the 1100s and in the 1200s over this demand by a reformed church and a reformed papacy for spiritual independence, total spiritual independence. And it's a rough battle, so that you get ups and downs, which are extraordinary, involving elections, which are really only occasionally in the hands of the cardinals in any serious way. I mean, to give you one example, the elections of 1123 and 1130 are elections in which these factions of Roman families are fighting against one another. And we don't even know all the ins and outs of the details of these elections. I believe it's the election of 1123 when there is, due to the different factions supported by different noble families, there are sort of secret anticipated meetings in which there's one person elected, and then when he's elected, the supporters of the other family come and beat up those who elected this other man, and then he retires, and there's another one elected, and it's not kosher, if you can use that word in these circumstances. And then there are further battles with king emperors from Germany that enter onto the scene, involving particularly the two famous king emperors, Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa, and then Frederick II. All right, and in the midst of these, there's a continuity of outside influences over cardinals who are going to be looked upon as being the effective immediate agents of electing the Pope, but with this outside influence. Now, at the time of Frederick II, there was a huge battle that continued over several pontificates between the popes and Frederick II, and there was a big interregnum in one of them. And in this interregnum, in one of them, the forces, the main civil forces in Rome, got so angry that what they did is they shoved the cardinals inside a building that there's still a debate over what it was. Was this an old building from the time of Septimius Severus? Was it another kind of building? So that there's debates over it. And we're told, however, that the cardinals were shoved into this building and there were guards on top of it. And the building was in need of repair. And in order to, just simply deal with their own needs, but then also perhaps to force the cardinals into doing something more, they just simply urinated into the holes in the beams on top of the cardinals. But it was a long conclave, and not conclave, we don't use that term yet, but it was a long interregnum and interruptions and the like. And this was a kind of pre-conclave shoving them in this fashion. Then what happens is there's another big interregnum that took place in 1268, after 1268, and it was a tricky situation because there was, as it moved along, no pope. The king of France, Louis the Ninth, died. There was no emperor. There was no king emperor. And so there was no heads of Christendom. And it goes on this interregnum from 1268 down to, I believe, 1271. And here too, what happened is that the people in the town where the election was taking place, and I think people escaped from it at times or whatever, the people in the town got frustrated and locked them up. They locked them up. And eventually, what they did was they, I think at this moment, they chose a commission to find somebody to elect a man. And what they did was they elected somebody who wasn't present there at all. They elected a man who was away with an English contingent fighting in whatever remained of the Holy Land at the time. An outsider, in other words. They elected an outsider, which is one of the things that makes me think that maybe they'll elect Bishop Schneider, this time around. But they elected an outsider, and the outsider who became Gregory the Tenth. He came back. He had to sail back from the Holy Land, and what he does. This man was a great pope. He was a great pope. He calls what is a very great council, a council at Lyon. There are two councils at Lyon. The first one was more just used as a tool against Frederick II, but the second one was a very great council. This is the one where Thomas Aquinas died on the way to the council, and Saint Bonaventure, I believe, was there present at the council. But at the council, and then afterwards, before the council already was planning this, and then at the council, Gregory the Tenth sets up the rules for what, for the first time, is called a conclave. All right, so that's when it really is going to come into being after this miserable long experience of yet another several year interregnum. And the document, I believe, is called Ubi Periculum, which sets up the rules for the conclave. And it's these quite stringent rules, again, of them meeting in one place, and then I think they have separate cubicles that they can go to. And then if they don't reach a conclusion after a certain number of days, then they're reduced to one meal, and then they're reduced to bread and water if it goes still further. And the immediate effect of it was to very drastically reduce the time of the conclave, the closed in room, which is what the name indicates, that the keys are given away to close you in, so you don't have contact with the outside world. But this was utterly detested by the cardinals. They loathed this, and they just ground their teeth and found ways to try to escape from it, successfully to escape from it, so that very quickly afterwards, it seems like it's fizzling out, and you have another long interregnum that lasts for a while at the beginning of the 1290s, at which you get another decision to try and find somebody from the outside to come to be pope, and you get the election of this monk, again under circumstances which historians debate. There's claims that one of the heads of the cardinals had a dream about him, and that he wrote, in any case, this monk a letter chastising the cardinals. But they elect this outsider, Pope Celestine, who's totally incapable of ruling, and who's totally otherworldly, and who, in a debated way, again, we don't know fully, either himself recognized that he was incapable or was convinced that he was incapable of ruling, so that you get a resignation and abdication, and you get the election of Boniface VIII, immediate election of Boniface VIII, who is a man who is familiar with the machinery of the Roman Curia, and a great diplomat as well. But under circumstances which were looked upon by people at the time as being dubious in character, so that you get Dante and his incredible arrogance at times, putting Celestine in hell, and Boniface as well. But this is the whole story of the conclave, and there's always been, annoyance of the cardinals. They're not happy at being locked up in this whole thing. But it does now have a history to it, and even if there's problems with it, it's going to move forward. There is with because there's so many intervening events that now take place. I mean, there's 1305. There's the election in France, or near the borders of France, of a pope who decides to settle in Avignon on the borders of the Kingdom of France. And there is a problem when in 1378, the Pope, who's at Avignon at the time, decides to return to Rome against the will of his cardinals, the majority of whom are French, but who go reluctantly with him. They're not happy about going to Rome because they like where they live. And if Avignon is a nice place to live. But Rome is a chaotic, tumultuous, and then disease-ridden place in 1378. And they return there, and then the Pope who returns, I believe it's Gregory the 11th, immediately dies. So they have to elect a new Pope in a conclave. And there were certain emergency rules that had been made to make sure that this was especially done fast. But the cardinals who gather in it are surrounded by a mob, and the mob threatens them with violence and says to them, "You will elect a Roman or at least an Italian as Pope," which they do. But when they elect him, they're not happy at having elected him, and something goes haywire with the guy who is elected, and the cardinals who elect him immediately, well, not immediately, but very, very swiftly, they flee from him and elect someone in his place and move back to Avignon. And then you get this whole problem with the Great Western Schism, with a pope in Rome, a pope in Avignon, and then a third pope who comes along when the cardinals from both Avignon and Rome decide to see if they can solve it, but only manage to make it worse by electing a third one. So that you have a finally reunited church in 1417 through the election of a pope that's not elected by the rules, the regular rules, because there's a change made, a one-time change to add new elements to the election of the Pope in order to try and see if they can solidify a unified papacy in the future. Right, but after that, it goes back to the whole conclave situation. And if you look at Ludwig von Pastor, who basically deals with the history of the papacy basically from this reunited time forward, you can see that there are a million problems with the conclave, with messages smuggled in, with bribery that takes place, with election campaigning during the conclave and the like, which has to be cleaned up once again in the Tridentine period with the Tridentine reforms. And even then, there are problems that come up, and sometimes extended election periods, until you get the next. It's not a difficulty because they manage under extraordinary circumstances to elect a pope in 1800, when Pius VI has been dragged off into imprisonment in France and dies along the way, and the cardinals manage to sneak their way to Venice to elect Pope Pius VII under extraordinary circumstances. But from that time forward, you move ahead in a way which is pretty regular in character. And since 1831, when there was a 54-day conclave, you've had pretty smooth regular elections, with the only bumps along the way being, and only for a few days, with Pius X's election, when there's that famous exclusion that is proclaimed through a Hungarian prelate under the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And then, a little bit of a bump at the time of John the 23rd's election, which people are still, you know, arguing about as well, to this one.